Welcome to this TubeDuel original podcast. Today, we're diving into an explainer on the eras of Apple. We're going to trace this wild ride from a literal garage to a trillion-dollar powerhouse. It's a massive story about vision, engineering, and just this absolute, relentless pursuit of design perfection.
But to really kick things off, let's look at a number that honestly kind of blows my mind: $800. So back in 1976, Apple actually had a third co-founder alongside Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, a guy named Ronald Wayne. He was sort of the adult in the room. He drafted the original partnership agreement, even drew up the very first company logo. But Wayne was gun-shy from a past business failure. So get this, after just 12 days, he cashed out. He sold his 10% tie-breaking stake back to the two Steves for a measly $800. If he'd held on to that, man, that stake would be worth billions today.
We've got over 40 years of history to chew on here, so we're going to break this explainer down into 5 defining eras: the garage beginnings, the Apple II and Macintosh, the ouster and the comeback, a design renaissance, and finally, the Apple Silicon era.
So, starting right off with era number 1, the garage beginnings, building the foundation.
Picture this. The year is 1976. Inside a stuffy Cupertino garage, a 21-year-old Steve Jobs has just somehow convinced this brilliant, self-taught engineer, Steve Wozniak, to quit his cushy gig at Hewlett-Packard. Their goal was pretty simple: build a computer that's cheap and easy to use. And you can see just how fast they moved. On one side, we have their very first product, the Apple I. Released on April Fool's Day in 1976, priced at a slightly creepy $666.66, it was literally a wooden box with a bare circuit board inside. Definitely just for the hardcore nerds. But then, literally just a year later in 1977, they dropped the Apple II. And wow, what a difference. Completely self-contained, sleek plastic case, it looked more like a friendly kitchen appliance than some intimidating piece of machinery.
Wozniak was smart. He knew that to start a real revolution, they couldn't just cater to the hobbyists anymore. So he packed it with these absolutely crucial features. We're talking high-resolution graphics that could actually show pictures, not just boring text lines, sound capabilities, a built-in basic programming language, and, this was huge, a floppy disk controller for saving your stuff easily. All of this made the Apple II just incredibly attractive and accessible for regular people. It ended up selling over 2 million units, and honestly, it became a total fixture in classrooms all across the country.
Which leads us perfectly into our second era, the Apple II and Macintosh, sparking the GUI revolution. Stepping into the 1980s, Apple was suddenly staring down some seriously fierce competition. Jobs decided they needed to pivot toward making computers that were, as he loved to say, insanely great. And that obsession gave us the 1984 Macintosh. You probably remember that legendary Ridley Scott Super Bowl commercial, right? Well, the computer itself really did change everything. Jobs had visited Xerox PARC and had this epiphany. The future of computing was visual. So the Mac brought the graphical user interface, or GUI, to everyday folks. For the first time, you could just point and click on a cute little icon with a mouse instead of typing lines of cryptic code into a dark, blinking screen. It was a total game changer.
To really get why the Mac was the absolute right move for them, you just have to compare it to their previous attempt, the Lisa. The Lisa came out a year earlier, and yeah, it had a graphical interface too. But look at that price, almost $10 grand, $10,000 in the early 80s. It was a complete financial disaster. Now, the Macintosh only had 128 kilobytes of RAM, tiny by today's standards, but it was priced at $2,495. Still a chunk of change, sure, but dramatically more affordable. It was the machine that actually put a mouse in the hands of the public.
Moving right along to era number 3, the ouster and the comeback, also known as Apple's wilderness years. So, despite how revolutionary the Mac was, things behind the scenes were a mess. Internal power struggles actually pushed Steve Jobs completely out of the company in 1985. Crazy, right? And without him, Apple really stumbled. The Mac lacked software, and these super cheap PC clones were absolutely flooding the market. By the mid-90s, Apple was bleeding market share to Windows PCs. They were desperate. They needed a modern operating system fast. So, in December 1996, they pulled the trigger on a massive move, buying a software company called Next for $429 million. But here is the brilliant twist. Next was founded by Steve Jobs. This acquisition was the Trojan horse that brought Jobs right back into Apple. And even better, Next's technology became the rock-solid foundation for macOS X.
And just like that, we enter our fourth era, a design renaissance and the birth of the digital lifestyle.
By 1997, Jobs is firmly back in charge, and he basically hits the reset button. He stops licensing out Apple software to clone makers, goes back to basics, and positions Apple as a true digital lifestyle brand. The absolute turning point? The 1998 iMac. Designed by Johnny Ive, this thing dropped like an alien spaceship in a world of boring beige plastic boxes. It was an all-in-one computer wrapped in this gorgeous transparent Bondi blue shell. It wasn't just a tool anymore, it was a statement piece. It was elegant. This whole philosophy, making tech uncompromisingly beautiful, is exactly what would soon give us the iPod in 2001, turning everyday gadgets into literal art.
And you know what I love about this is how it connects right back to the beginning. Think about Steve Wozniak's original mandate from way back in 1977. He said, "To me, a personal computer should be small, reliable, convenient to use, and inexpensive." When you look at what Jobs and Ive did with the iMac, the iPod, and eventually the iPhone, they were basically just fulfilling Woz's core dream, just on a massive, global scale that those two guys in a California garage could never have imagined.
Let's transition to our fifth and final era, the Apple Silicon era, reinventing the core. See, Apple's obsession with control didn't just stop at that pretty outer shell. It went all the way down to the microscopic architecture inside the machine. You can trace this wild evolution over the decades. They started with Motorola processors, jumped to PowerPC in the 90s, and then made a huge pivot to Intel chips in 2006. But the ultimate flex? That happened between 2020 and 2023. Apple completely ditched Intel and transitioned everything to their own custom, ARM-based processors, Apple Silicon. This meant they literally controlled the entire widget, top to bottom, hardware to software. The result? Laptops and desktops with just completely unbelievable power and battery life.
The real takeaway here is that this relentless integration, owning the OS, the beautiful design, and now the actual silicon brains inside, it pushed Apple into the stratosphere. I mean, look at that number. That's $1 trillion. In August 2018, Apple officially became the first publicly traded company on Earth to hit a $1 trillion valuation. That is a staggering achievement, all built on decades of just stubbornly defying industry norms.
When you step back and look at this whole crazy journey, from a literal wooden box in a stuffy garage to a $1 trillion valuation, it really leaves us with one big question. With custom Apple Silicon now driving their future, and a design philosophy that absolutely refuses to compromise, what on earth are they going to disrupt next? Definitely something to chew on the next time you tap an app or open up your laptop. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning and keep that curiosity hungry.